Maybe we want to
All
shift.
these gaps.
We may want to shift down one.
Down one.
I think Elder Morningstar is coming in, so there may be. I'm not sure who that may be just.
Check 1, 2. Andrew?
I hope Mary comes because she's amazing.
I know.
I want to
She
hear
is
her.
coming. I know she's coming, but our meeting is tomorrow as well. Do you see her? I wonder if she's in the. She would be in the overflow room. Yeah. I didn't provide my.
She didn't send a quick email or anything. I left my phone over there so I couldn't check.
So as we start to fill up, just to remind people, there is an overflow room, a video overflow room. So if you're finding you're standing, you're not comfortable on the benches, FSS 1030, it's just downstairs on the first floor in that direction. There's lots of signs. And we're going to have people there who will text questions back and forth. So there will be a way to interact with the plenary panelists. But it's not looking terrible in here, but it is getting a little bit crowded. So that's why we have the overflow room. Carry on for now. Not quite ready.
Wait. My flight has been delayed at every stage. We're currently sitting on the runway, waiting to go into the gate in Ottawa. I will likely be a few minutes late. Maybe there as soon as I can. I'm so sorry for the
Always like to listen on speakerphone.
That's so stressful to be somewhere.
Sorry.
She's late.
Yeah, I hate that feeling.
Yeah, I don't know. That's why I always try to
Yeah.
avoid driving this.
Not that I know how she's getting here, but I can't stand
like what does she
driving
mean?
here. Or put it on. Like
Because you could track
combination. Yeah.
do anything about it.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. I just turned off all the sound.
Breathe and keep
Well, if you're on the chain, you can send an email. If you're on the chain, you can phone and say, I'm going to be late. Like that.
Nothing was okay. I'm not sure if I've never. This is a new one, and I don't know how good it is. It's actually not a top of the line anymore. So it's 416.
all this well.
One. Emma, one. Long distance, 416 859.
0022. Thank you.
Oh, hi, Mary. This is Jackie Kennelly calling from the Coming Up Together conference. Hi, we just got your email. Sorry to hear about this. Okay, so, well, you had suggested putting you on speaker so you could take in, or how far are you from? I mean, we're just about to get started, but. Okay. You know what? You're not going to miss much because we're going to do the opening prayer and then I'm going to do some logistics and then just come in and join the panel when you get here. Okay? No.
These are usually you can do the presentation.
Yeah. I think you won't miss very much.
Are you okay with moving your slides?
Yeah, like my friend who's going to help me with sound person. There's still
Okay.
some I'm trusting in the universities.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Great. We'll see you soon.
We're gonna put her on. We were gonna put her on speakerphone. Are we doing that now?
She's about 10 minutes away. So
Okay.
just let her
Yeah.
comment.
Yeah. That sounds good.
Yeah. She was just talking about using the podium, but you're already on board for that, right?
Yeah. I feel like I'm being bossy, but I wouldn't say to everyone, there's still before 7 seats in the room if you want to go.
People don't want to sit on the front row.
I know.
I think it's because they're afraid that, me too, they're afraid they're going to get asked to participate or something. Twins. Oh, Claire.
Was it a bit too long?
Bit long?
I'm just. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just whatever you feel comfortable taking it. If you don't, that's fine. Maybe one line. I think this is in the program too, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't need any introduction, but just my name.
Oh, well, I'm going to read it out.
Okay.
It
It always
funny
seems
if I
like
just
just
said,
and this is Naomi. I know.
but if there's something in there you want to.
Yeah, I could delete some stuff.
Okay, just a little bit. Like, it should be balanced, right?
Okay.
I've lost my program. Are any of you doing other presentations? You are as well.
Yeah, this afternoon.
Okay, this afternoon, and you're doing another presentation. Okay. You good? Oh, no, that's perfect. That's great.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience.
She wants just a little bit more time.
We're going to formally begin the conference now. I will remind folks one more time, we do have a video overflow room if you're not comfortable where you are, because there's not quite enough chairs. And it is downstairs on the first floor, FSS 1030. There are signs. But without further ado, it's a real pleasure to welcome the elder in residence from University of Ottawa, Morning Star. She's from the Aboriginal Centre at the U of O and originally from the Cree Nation, and she's going to start off our conference with an opening prayer.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. First of all, we must acknowledge the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, and I acknowledge them and thank them for caring for this land and sharing it with us. So that is first and foremost of importance to acknowledge them. I would like to offer to you my grandfather's prayer for mankind. I just got off the highway from Quebec, and I'm a little bit out of breath, and it was pretty icy, the roads, and lots of wind and rain, but here we are, even shining on a rainy day after coffee, though. But I'd like to offer you my grandfather's prayer for your conference. And in this prayer, you will hear where is our home, our first home, our first family. This prayer is the prayer called the Sea Wind Prayer, and it's a prayer for humanity. Iko kwalas, chin kwalas, iadith long sitchin slothlin, kwasam chil kwasam squile, Shiakam shiakamtum to shiakamalia, ska amtum skamalia spaqualia, thiliahalgas, nautolus, quilatalis. Dear Father, great Father and beloved Mother Earth, we thank you for this creation. We thank you for this planet, this home. And at the beginning of creation, Father and Mother, you've given us the mountains, the valleys, the streams, the forests, our gardens, our orchards. We are thankful for this home, this planet, this earth. We thank you for the human race, our brothers and sisters. You've also given us all our feathered friends that fly in the air, the eagle, the dove, the hawk, the bird. Thank you for these relatives, this family. And not only that, Father and Mother, you've given us all the water creatures that dwell in the waters, the salmon, the whale, the dolphin, and the fish. I thank you for these relatives, this family. And you've also given us the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they've all been placed in the heavens for a reason. I thank you for this creation, this home, this earth. And you've also given us the four winds that blow in the four corners of the world. I thank you for this home, and I thank you for the mind of right relationship, compassion, kindness, caring and sharing. And I thank you for the air we breathe, and the fire element, the water, and the earth spirit. Thank you. Bless everyone here, and may they have a good conference. May our eyes and hearts be opened from this moment on. Aho. Aho. So I just want to also say that in saying the prayer, I hope today we may recognize all that we share as a home here, and everyone has a right to a place of shelter and a nest or a home somewhere. If you look at the nature, which is our living book of knowledge, she shows that every sentient being, every living creature has a right to a home. And we all have a spiritual duty to care for one another and make sure we all are cared for. Aho.
Thank you, Morning Star. That was beautiful. Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. You have no idea how excited I am to see you all here, and you probably have no idea, because I didn't, how much work is involved in bringing everyone together. So we are so excited that you're here, and we hope everything goes smoothly. We know it won't. It already isn't, but that's okay. So one flaw in our plan, which we knew from the beginning, was a conference in February, and there's freezing rain, and the flights are delayed. And so one of our plenary panelists is trying to get here as fast as she can. She got stuck on the tarmac, and she's in a cab probably as we speak. So Mary Birdsell will be joining us as soon as she can up here. So I'm going to start us off with some thanks, some logistical information. My name is Jackie Kennelly. I should offer you my name. I am the crazy person who took this on, also known as the conference convener. And this event, it's the culmination of 18 months of hard work from so many people, just actually countless numbers of people, most of whom, but not all, are listed in your program. There's been so much energy, enthusiasm, passion, and time put into making this event come true. And we hope you're all able to benefit from it and that you'll walk away from these 3 days with new tools, new connections, new ideas, and new energy for ending youth homelessness in Canada and elsewhere in the world. So we are incredibly fortunate to be able to gather here, not only because this is an amazing place to be in a beautiful room with an incredible group of people, but also because we've been very pleasantly mobbed by people wanting to attend this conference. We eventually had to cap registration. We probably waited too long because we wanted to have as many people attend as possible, hence the somewhat crowded conditions, the overflow room. We still have a waiting list of 30 or more people who want to attend the conference. There's a lot of interest and passion, enthusiasm for this topic, which is fabulous. So because of this, we would like to apologize for the somewhat cramped conditions that we're putting you in, and I will remind folks again, there is an overflow room for the plenary panels. It ought to not be so crowded in the breakout sessions, so I think we'll be fine during the days, but the beginning and end of each day, we're always going to have a video overflow room, and that room today is FSS 1030. We'll always have signs posted. It's a different room tomorrow. So because we are videotaping the plenary panel, it also means that we're able to broadcast it. So there's a live stream. So if you know folks who would like to attend the conference but weren't able to because we capped registration or they're elsewhere in the country, they can watch on our website. We'll be having these plenary panels videotaped, and they're probably being videotaped right now, and will be on the website under a tab called Plenary Panels, and then they'll be up on YouTube. I'll also point out that for that overflow room, we do have volunteers in each room. So if you do move to the overflow room, or for people who are watching this in the overflow room, there are volunteers in the overflow room who are going to communicate questions back to the volunteers in this room. So once we get into the interactive part of the panel, there'll be a chance for the people who are in the video overflow room to also convey questions to the panelists. So we do have a system in place for that. So just a few housekeeping items I'd like to note before we move on to our opening plenary. You've probably already interacted with one or more of our amazing volunteer team. We have over 70, I've lost track, undergraduate and graduate students from Carleton, from U of O, as well as community volunteers from the youth serving sector and elsewhere who are helping us all stay on top of the logistics for the conference. You can identify volunteers by the volunteer label. So mine says organizer, but theirs says volunteer. So if you're looking for someone who has information, hopefully, about where to go and what is happening, you can look for the people with the volunteer or organizer label on their name tag, and we'll do our best to help you out. You may have noticed in our program we have a winter clothing bank for people to make use of, should they find our Ottawa winter unsavory. Of course, today it's raining. Or maybe we should have had a raining clothing drive instead. But today it's in room FSS 4014, which is just over there. It's going to be in a different room tomorrow. But please feel free to drop by if you find you don't have enough warm clothes. And you can borrow them for the conference. You could keep them if you'd like, or you could return them. Anything that we have left at the end of the conference, we're going to donate to Operation Come Home, which is a local youth serving agency. You may also have noticed that we have a youth-focused art show as part of our conference. All of these amazing, innovative pieces, by the way, were introduced by our youth team. And so the youth art show is happening in FSS 4012, which is over there. It's not far from the Winter Clothing Bank. All the art is for sale. All proceeds will go directly back to the artists themselves. We can only accept cash or check for that purpose, and there is an ATM over in the University Centre, which is the building, just 2 buildings over that way, if you need to get some cash out. In FSS 5015, which I think actually is that window up there, that's the Youth Chill Out Lounge. We've just discovered this room won't stay open. It was one of those small details. But the volunteer who's in there, as in it is locked, but the volunteer who's in there has the pass card. So this is meant to be a space for young people who are attending the conference, 30 and under. We're not checking your ID. We'll let you kind of self-identify. But meant to be a kind of quiet space to hang out. There'll always be volunteers on hand. There's board games and cards and puzzles and things, so just kind of a quiet space. But now that we know the door is locked, just give it a knock, and the volunteer there will open it up for you, and you can use that space as you need it. And in 4004, and all of these numbers are in the program, by the way, our Youth Spirit Flags Memorial Project is set up. And you may have received an email about this project already. It's been initiated by the youth team of the Coming Up Together conference, and it's an opportunity to highlight the unnecessary costs of youth homelessness, which takes often, unfortunately and tragically, takes the form of young people who've lost their lives due to their street involvement or lack of housing. So as many of you will know, if you're working in the sector, the mortality rate for young people who are homeless is tragically and unnecessarily high. If you would like to make a youth memorial spirit flag in memory of a young person you knew, there are supplies available and people who can help you with that. And there will always be volunteers in that room. We also have dedicated mental health volunteers. So if you're experiencing distress throughout the conference, those mental health volunteers will be circulating between the Chill Out Lounge and the memorial room, and the volunteers in those rooms have their numbers. So if you need to contact someone and we have a space, you can just go to quietly talk to someone if you need it. Please also check your programs for the amazing lunchtime and evening events. Today in this room at lunch, all the lunches will be laid out where our breakfast was. They're lunch boxes you can carry with you. And today, Alex Abramovich will be showing his films on LGBTQ2S+ youth's experiences of homelessness called Brokered Dialogues. And that's happening here in this room. You can pick up your lunchbox and come back. Tomorrow in this room, we have the Forum Theatre performance of young people who with disabilities who've experienced homelessness. It's an interactive play with the youth team from that group called Partnering for Change from McMaster University. It's going to be wonderful. On Thursday, there are the walking tours, which are led by 5 members of our youth team. And you may have seen already there's a sign-up sheet. I haven't checked it. I don't know if it's full already. But those walking tours, we're going to cap them at 15 people to keep them reasonable. So we won't have space for everyone, but they're going to be fabulous. And you can sign up at the registration table. And tomorrow night, we're having a musical showcase at Mavericks, which is a bar on Rideau Street. And that's going to be a performance by young people with lived experiences of homelessness, musical, poetry, spoken word showcase. There's also going to be an open stage at the end of that. So if any of you would like to get up, I'm going to have my guitar there. I might even play a song. All I know are kids' songs these days, so you can all join me in a round of Down by the Bay. That'll be tomorrow night. Okay. So those are the logistics. I tried to drag them out a bit to give Mary time to arrive, but I think we're going to get started because we're running a little bit behind. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for the opening plenary panel, which is on housing as a human right. Mary Jane McKitterick is from Away Home Canada, and she will be introducing our plenary.
Welcome, everyone. My name, as you know, is Mary Jane McKitterick, and I'm the Community Planning Manager with Away Home Canada, our national coalition to prevent and committed to preventing and ending youth homelessness. I use pronouns she and her. I'm thrilled to be here among this company of speakers and the one who's about to arrive, and I can't wait to hear from these leaders in their field. Today, I will begin by introducing the speakers. ahead of time. They will each have a few minutes to share and inspire us with their ideas and commitment. Following that, the speakers will have a few minutes to respond to one another, and then there will be some time for questions from all of you. And we're also apparently going to take questions, texts from the outflow room, so that'll be interesting. Okay, cool. So I'll just do a very, very brief introduction. In 2016, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing challenged governments around the world to make the elimination of homelessness a top human rights priority with particular attention on youth. This panel has embraced this call to action. In fact, for many years has been doing that, the folks on this panel. Based on their research and experience, panelists will now share how folks share with you who are working in communities, local, national strategies, and on policy, how to ground your work in human rights, international human rights. Just to mention a couple of resources that we have that would also support this. There is a guide called Human Rights Right Now, Ending Youth Homelessness, a human rights guide. It was developed by Canada Without Poverty in partnership with Away Home Canada, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and FIANSA. And FIANSA is the European Federation of National Organizations Working with the Homeless. It's an important tool for those of you who are engaged in, who are community planners, service providers, researchers, policymakers, and government. It's an excellent tool for helping you, again, ground your work in human rights. And it can be found on the Away Home website at awayhome.ca. Also, just recently this month, there's another report from the Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing on the right to non-discrimination in housing, and it outlines the value of a human rights-based approach to housing, broadly speaking. Housing strategies describes the key principles upon which effective rights-based housing strategies must be based. I think there's 8 principles, and they're actually in the website. There's I don't know, promoting each principle per day or something. But it's also a really important tool to help ground your work. I would like to introduce our speakers, and now we'll introduce Mary, even though she's not here yet, but hopefully she can just slide in. We're very pleased to have, and they're sitting in the order that they will speak. Cindy Ross is a prolific artist who is an ex-homeless young adult. She does a lot of volunteering within her community on a peer-to-peer level, doing outreach and health education to street youth. Recently, she and others have started an outreach program run by current and ex-street youth, transitional age youth. And her pronouns are she and her. Mary Birdsall, as you know, is on her way. She is a lawyer and executive director at Justice for Children and Youth, a child and youth rights legal aid clinic. Mary advocates for the rights of children across a range of legal subjects and at every level of court in Canada. She established the clinic's unique program offering legal services to homeless and unstably housed young people more than 15 years ago. And Mary regularly speaks about the rights of children and youth with young people and professionals who work with them. Her pronouns are she and her. Claire Nobbs is the Director of Transitional Housing at EGAL. She has 15 years of experience in community development with LGBTQ2IS youth. Her research explored the impact of culturally connected mentoring on the emotional well-being and resilience of LGBTQ2IS youth, and the experiences of sexual and gender minority youth with the residential youth justice and child welfare systems. Mary now oversees EGAL's youth outreach, and in early 2019, and this is very exciting, EGAL Centre, a 30-unit transitional housing facility in the downtown East End of Toronto. Please, I think that's worth a little extra clap there. This is a big, an important development. So that's coming in 2019, and Claire uses the pronouns she and her. And Naomi Nichols, at the end, is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at McGill University. Prior to joining the Faculty of Education at McGill, Nichols completed a postdoctoral fellowship with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness at York. And Naomi's research activities and publications span the areas of many, but a few: youth homelessness, youth justice, alternative education and safe schools, interorganizational relations in the youth sector, youth at risk, and community academic research collaborations. Naomi uses the pronouns she and her. So I think I'll just allow these folks to give you, to share their information and their expertise and inspire us all with their work. And I'll just invite Cindy to come on up and start with that. Thank you.
Just
Oh,
in
there she
time.
is. Okay.
I'll signal to you if it gets in
Hi. So, as she said, my name is Cindy Ross. So, my experience has been with homelessness since I was a young teen. I was first homeless when I was 14 years old, and then was chronically homeless for 10 years after that. Dealing with, I've dealt with a lot of issues regarding housing as a human right and being denied by landlords based on either appearance, age discrimination, and other things like income. Canada has agreed that. Oh, God damn it! I'm so sorry. I'm really nervous right now. Okay. Canada has agreed to be agreed that we will make a commitment to having housing as a right. It is enshrined in the charter, but we have not actually made it into law, unfortunately. In 2016, there was a charter challenge by 4 Ontario homeless men. Okay. Please don't make me do it. I can't do it. No. No.
Do you have notes?
No. I lost my notes.
Do you want to just have a minute to breathe and see how you feel?
I can't do it. I'm sorry.
It's fine.
I can't do it.
Don't worry. Okay. Here, let's go for it.
So that's great. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, everyone. I guess Claire's next. Wonderful. Okay, great. Thanks. I'll have Claire up to talk.
In my other life, I'm a storyteller and I'm inclined to go off topic, so I have a PowerPoint to keep me grounded. Really. Okay, thank you. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. All right. At every level of human rights legislation, housing is identified as key, including and specifically the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I was reminded in my reading yesterday, Canada was the last country to sign. I'd like to draw our attention to Jessie Thistle's brilliant work, introduced last year, in developing the Indigenous definition of homelessness that has so much more value than the concept, or outlines so much more than the concept of mere houselessness, the need for physical shelter. While I acknowledge and respect fully that Jessie's research focuses on Indigenous peoples and the legacy of colonization, I do believe he offers us a deeply valuable framework that can help inform all of us in this work. We need to consider how people are denied more than just shelter when they become homeless. Yeah. Homelessness is a structural issue. When a person is experiencing mental health challenges, is Indigenous, Black, or otherwise racialized, living with physical and/or invisible disabilities, and/or is LGBTQ2S or I, or any combination of the above identities and more, these intersecting layers of identity will impact their experience of homelessness, the age at which they become homeless, the duration and number of episodes of homelessness, their experiences of individual and structural violence before and while homeless, and their capacity to eventually find and sustain affordable housing. At the core for our young people is the issue of family disconnection, too often brought about by intergenerational violence, colonialism, racism, ignorance, and poverty, which, as we know, are all connected. I don't trust technology, but It works. Don't go out on me. As we know from Mayer, minority stress describes the adverse effect of social conditions such as prejudice and stigma on the lives of affected individuals and groups. And the good work of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, Away Home, and others highlights the inextricable links between mental health and homelessness. And if you haven't read this wonderful policy brief yet, please do. You can find it on the Away Home website and on the COH website. It outlines how services are still, in their silos, falling short of serving the complex and intersecting needs of the young people whose lives literally hang in the balance. If we look more closely, specifically with regard to lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, intersex, and two-spirit youth, we see how vulnerable this population becomes. Family conflict too often leads to homelessness, and without parental support, the risk of suicidality among trans youth, for example, increases by a staggering 97%. I'm going to read that again. Strong parental support for trans youth has been shown to reduce suicidality by up to 97%. Think about that when you hear parents or families talk about their trans kid in disparaging ways, and encourage them to go get help, because it doesn't have to be that way. Child welfare involvement increases the likelihood of individual and systemic violence while in care, and also significantly increases the risk of homelessness upon leaving care. And as you can see on the left there, in Canada, 7.8% of trans and 62.8% of LGBTQ2SI homeless youth have had involvement with child welfare. In this slide, we see how the challenges faced by this population perpetuate one another and further entrench them in a cycle of homelessness if there is no meaningful and sustainable intervention. A cycle of discrimination leads to family and community violence. Add to that racial profiling, where youth of color and Indigenous youth in particular experience very high levels of harassment and intimidation. And then more violence as a result of being homeless, the risk of which is even higher when you add LGBTQ2SI identity. And I'd like to draw your attention to the Urban Alliance on Race Relations report from their study in 2015, where they explored the experiences of racialized LGBTQ LGBTQ homeless youth in Toronto. And they talked in particular about this what my professor, Akua Benjamin, would call the dialectic, where the dichotomy of being highly visible and yet extremely and chronically invisible. So invisible on the streets in terms of care, support, the poor level of service or denial of service because of their who they are and how they present, and which our previous speaker spoke to so well. And yet at the same time being so visible, sticking out like a sore thumb on the street when it comes to being targeted, both by individuals, by community, and also by the police. It's a great report. So we see how the multiple structural disadvantages, criminalization of homelessness, racialization of poverty, police profiling, and violence against LGBTQI2S youth all serve as risk factors for homelessness. I'll give an example of a racialized teen trans woman who engages in sex work in order to survive. She can't get a job. Landlords won't give her the time of day. She experiences violence on a daily basis and is targeted by the cops. Further violence. She's little choice but to engage in high-risk behaviors, usually and often leading to addiction to substances and further reducing her chances of finding and sustaining housing. And that, over the years in my work in working with LGBTQ2SI youth, I think has been the most chronic challenge for me, is working with this particular individual. And I say this as a an example of an experience, but it's chronic and it's over and over to the point where they don't even believe they can get housing themselves. So they almost give up. And it's very hard to center an individual's experience and honor their choices when you can see this spiral happening and how to intervene in that moment and yet continue to honor their choices. And I don't know the answer. And if you have the answer, I'm going to stick around for the day. You let me know. And one of the ways, the first step, I believe, is supporting people's immediate needs, building community and addressing their mental health challenges, their emotional challenges, call it what they want to call it, how they identify it, support them where they're at. And at EGAL, we began by opening EGAL Youth Outreach to build trust and community with and for LGBTQI2S youth up to age 29 and working to respond to their needs on their terms. And since July, I've had the honor of overseeing and supporting that program. Providing service to youth who are homeless, about to become homeless, or are precariously housed. They have scheduled appointments, or they can drop in and have crisis counseling, support, food. They get their tokens for transportation. We have groups and activities. We have a nurse practitioner comes in and meets with them one-on-one in employment supports. We create a safer space that is exclusive to this group, and we see sometimes 25, even to 35 youth a day. And as Mary Jane said, looking ahead, deep breath, thanks to the generosity of private funders, the City of Toronto, the Toronto Central LHIN, and countless community partners, and to the great work of Alex Abramovich, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and many others, we are now building the EGAL Centre, set to open in early 2019. It will be a transitional facility for LGBTQI2S youth from age 16 to 29, where they may stay for approximately 1 year, give or take, right, Alex? But as Jessie Thistle reminds us so well, we cannot be successful in lifting youth out of homelessness if all we offer them is a roof and a bed. They will need cultural safety, particularly the Indigenous youth, the Black youth. We need to work on that. That is our work. They will need counseling and other mental health supports, help with reconnecting to family and community, safe, relevant health care, help with building skills that families might otherwise have taught them, such as budgeting, cooking, nutrition, employment supports and job training, referrals to relevant and appropriate services, and much more. Our intention is to build relationships with multiple community partners, including consulting with the Two-Spirit community on an ongoing basis. We plan to develop programming that not only serves the youth while living at EGAL Centre, but helps them to transition into longer-term sustainable housing with support from housing navigators to help them post-transition. And as we grow, we will continue to pressure all levels of government to recognize that racism, colonialism, trans, bi, and homophobia are directly affecting the right of LGBTQI2S youth to safe, affordable housing. Thank you so much.
Mary Birdsall, please come on down.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I was so late. I thought that on that very, very early flight I could get here on time, and I should have planned differently. Anyway, I'm very sorry that I missed the introductions, but I'm just going to go from here. So I, as you may have heard, am a lawyer, and so I'm sorry about that, but there you go. And for lawyers, rights are often this thing that we think of as sort of a tool, and we think of them as a tool that we're regularly using in our practice, in what we do. So I want to talk a little bit about that and talk a little bit about housing as a human right from a lawyer's point of view. And I know that our task was to speak sort of in an aspirational way and to our vision for the future, but I'm going to be a little bit more of a downer than that, if you don't mind. And partly it's because I think as a lawyer looking at housing as a human right, which seems so intuitively obvious, it's a bit of a downer. And I wanted to start with a quick story about a child in my life who, when she was 6 years old, there was a United Way ad that ran on television, and it had a woman standing over a kitchen sink with a can opener, opening a can, and at the same time as she was using the can opener, the ceiling was coming off. I don't know if anybody remembers this ad. It was probably a while ago, like maybe even 10 years ago. Anyway, this child in my world was 6 years old, and she was watching that ad, and the over voice was saying, some people have to choose between food and housing. And she said, well, that's ridiculous. Of course you have to have housing, or else you can't have anything else. And it was so striking to me because I had been working in the field for a little while, and I thought, well, that's amazing. So 6-year-olds get it, no problem at all. But we can't convince judges or lawmakers or governments to do the right thing. Anyway, I want to say that I think that rights are something to which we all owe a duty. Not only are we entitled to them, but especially as people who live in positions of power like I do, you have to see the rights realization of other people as something to which you owe a duty. So I would also say that rights can be framed as something that are aspirational, so we articulate grand visions of what rights can be and what they should be and what they are in our minds. But they also have to be functional and enforceable if they're really going to take hold, and people who experience the kinds of multiple layers of disadvantage and exclusion that Claire has described, if they're going to be real for all of us, not just those of us who walk easily in the halls of power. So, the other piece I want to say about rights before I start to talk about some of the really boring stuff is that, again, as Claire has said, I think it's important for us all to see rights as interconnected and intersecting in ways that you might not expect, so that you can't have one set of rights without also having others, and that achievement or a failure to find achievement in one area will also mean that there is achievement or a failure to find achievement in other areas. So, the United Nations is often sort of responsible for developing aspirational rights articulation. So we have many, many United Nations conventions, United Nations declarations, United Nations international covenants, these kinds of things. And I'm going to start there because I think they frame for us these aspirational articulations. They help us to develop on an international level broad-based support for the ideas of rights aspiration, and we hope that they inspire political and civil society involvement in the pursuit and achievement of those rights. So at that level, it's sort of exciting, it's emotionally moving, people feel engaged, there's a vision that we create, and then for a frontline lawyer on the streets of Toronto, it's frustrating and sometimes makes you feel pretty cynical. But before we go to that cynical place, we want to talk a little bit about the United Nations and say that the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which includes a right to housing among many other things, was adopted by the United Nations in 1948. So that was a good solid 60 years ago, 70 years ago, what am I saying? I'm falling behind myself. 70 years ago, we had an internationally recognized right to housing. So along with the UN Declaration of Human Rights came sort of lots of talking and lots of discussing and lots of other things. And I'm going to come back to this idea that the International Declaration doesn't actually mean that you in Canada can go to a lawyer or a judge or a court or a government and say you must do these things. But we're at the aspirational level still. So then comes the International Bill of Human Rights, which involves the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and they all kind of go together, and then a whole bunch of other international covenants come along, including, and I'm going to mention in particular, although I'll come back to this, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and most recently, UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, all of which mention the right to housing and other sort of social and political and economic rights. So all the way along, we've got all this beautiful articulation of aspirational goals toward human rights realization generally, including the right to housing and security of the person. in signing these international documents, I want to do a little bit of an aside, the UN drafts these things, then creates the document, then various states parties sign on. I'm sure you all know this is doubly boring for that reason, and individual countries ratify. And so then, ideally, what you would do once you ratify an international convention or treaty or declaration would be to say, we're going to adopt that into domestic law. That's going to become the law in Canada. But frankly, it has never really happened in Canada. There are a few things that we've done along the way that really are just piecemeal bits of enforceable, practical realization of these rights. So they stay at this sort of aspirational level. The other thing I'm going to, as I head down the cynical path, the other thing I want to say is that UN conventions are hard won. And as I'm sure you can all appreciate, all the nation states or party states in the world at the UN have to come together and agree about all these things, given their own unique cultural, political, economic realities. And so things get, softened, maybe watered down, all these kinds of things. And one of the things that I would say comes up in the UN Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, where housing is an important part, is that domestic implementation will be seen to articulate or based on the principle of progressive realization. Now, of course, this is important because we have to start somewhere for people who have very little footing in the area. But it also makes it possible for countries like Canada, who are very, very wealthy, to sort of go very, very slowly. And if you think of that we've been supposed to be working on this since 1948, then I would suggest that we've been moving very, very slowly indeed. So what the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights says is that people have a right to an adequate standard of living, including food, clothing, and housing, and the right to continuous improvement of living conditions. They also, in the next article, says that we have a right to enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and that we have a right to education generally, but also about our rights. And I would love to spend some time talking about that, but I'm going to resist. So we've got these interconnected, indivisible, intersecting rights. They're articulated at a broad-based level, an aspirational level. And then we also have further discussions such that a thing called the Limburg Principle says that the implementation that legislative measures alone are not sufficient. Administrative, judicial, policy, economic, social, and educational measures will be required by governments to ensure that these rights are in place. So, as much as I admire the international documents and as much as we use them in our work, doing frontline lawyering work, I also feel cynical about them, as I may have mentioned before now. So I want to turn to domestic law and say a couple of things about that. When we are trying to develop functional realities for rights, we have to create opportunities for implementation, and we have to create awareness about the existence of such rights so that people will say, oh, this is actually a right, I should be entitled to it. And I want to come back and say something else about rights and international rights and human rights in particular, is what we say about them, especially in the child rights world, which is a whole nother also topic for discussion, is that rights are inherent to our human dignity. We don't have to earn them. So when we're talking about children's rights, people often talk about, oh, children have to earn their rights by behaving in particular ways, or, rights come with responsibilities. And what we always push there is that actually that's not the case. Rights are inherent to human dignity, and that what you start with is treating people in a rights-respecting manner, and that the rest of the things, including responsibilities, flow from that. But really, it's us who are responsible for implementing rights and treating people in rights-respecting kinds of ways. So, what does domestic law, local governments, and organizations, what do we all do in order to pursue international human rights norms, and in particular, the right to housing? One of the things I would say is that Canada this year declared that the right to housing is a human right. And while that is a wonderful domestic sort of realization or articulation of that, back to 1948, right? So this is not, in fact, a new idea. It's not, in fact, a new sort of recognition that this is a reality. It is a new articulation by the federal government in this clear way. And what has flowed from it is a promise of tremendous attention towards progressive programming, paying attention to the academics and the frontline people and others who have paid a lot of attention to these issues and who know a lot. We actually know a lot about how to make these things real. And money to back up those kinds of things, which is all very, very good news. The other kinds of things that we have domestic law are more when getting back to my sort of comment at the beginning about lawyers looking for tools to implement rights, to articulate rights, and to try and enforce them. So we have labor laws, we have employment laws, and those kinds of things are there to try and support people. But what we all know is that people who are most excluded from the labor law world or the employment law world, those people who have more precarious employment, who have more temporary employment, who have less sort of permanent or even formal kinds of employment, are actually left out of existing rights regimes. So, like to use a very middle-class example, babysitters have very few employment law rights, and it flows from there. Same with labor law, obviously, unless you're in a trade union, most things about labor law are actually inapplicable to you, even if you, for instance, work on a temporary basis at a midway, the sort of summer fairs and festivals. We also have laws around Social Security and support, so OW. ODSP. But for instance, if you are 16 or 17 and you need social assistance, there are all sorts of extra and more burdensome rules that apply to you as a 16 and 17-year-old. So getting OW is more difficult. And on the front lines, as a matter of practice, OW workers are often just denying people the right to even apply. So even applying takes an extra help and sometimes the help of a lawyer. If you want to get ODSP because you have a disability that's more permanent in its nature, you have to be over the age of 18, so it's inaccessible if you're a younger teenager. Again, we have landlord and tenant laws, but the less sort of stable and permanent your housing is, the fewer rights actually are there to protect you. So if you live in a shared accommodation situation with your landlord, you have almost no rights at all. The other area that we have that Claire mentioned is child protection, child welfare laws and legislation, where children are meant to have rights to be protected from harm and to be cared for in meaningful ways. And we all know, I think, quite a bit about how deeply this system has failed people, especially Indigenous children and racialized children in Canada. So again, the more intersecting points of social exclusion that affect you as a person, the more likely these systems are to fail you. We also have human rights legislation, but one of the things that's difficult about human rights legislation is that it's really there to ensure that there is a possible response when you can prove that there's been a violation. So that doesn't sort of mesh with this idea that they're inherently available to you to maintain your human dignity. It really is more of a sort of an enforcement tool than anything else. So, how human rights currently work, I would say, means there's no existing model for enforcing housing as a human right. And in particular, when we look at housing as a human right as so much more than just, a roof and a wall. So, the other thing that I think Cindy was going to mention was a case in Ontario a few years ago where a group of people got together involving some very powerful lawyers, some very powerful organizations, and went to the courts to say there's a charter violation happening around here with respect to homelessness. We aren't even living up to not only our aspirational international goals, but the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we do see as having teeth. And sadly, in that case, the court decided that they wouldn't even really hear the evidence, and the matter was dismissed at the Court of Appeal after having been dismissed at a lower court on the basis that there just was no real foundation to the case. So, having got to kind of a sad place, I'd suggest, I'm going to get a little bit sadder and say the other kinds of laws we have are actually there, and Claire mentioned this as well, that create additional barriers. So not only are these sort of rights protections things not necessarily in place, and we have other laws that are supposed to protect some of these things, but they don't really, especially if you're at the margins. And then in particular, we have things like the Safe Streets Act, like loitering bylaws, like parks bylaws that prohibit sleeping and enable people to search and arrest. Even the new cannabis legislation, as it's going to function in Ontario, gives police officers additional search powers related to the suspicion of cannabis. And one of the outcomes of that may include a greater level of surveillance and police surveillance related to people who use public space to do sort of things that are sometimes considered private. I'm going to end the sad part of my commentary on talking about child welfare protections, because there's a new act in Ontario, the Child, Youth and Family Services Act, that is going to offer new and enhanced services to 16 and 17-year-olds as part of the changes. And people are very excited about this and looking forward to the ways in which we might help to support teenagers more effectively. But what I want to say about that is I ask all of you to sort of take up this mantle that I'm invoking about a rights-based approach to the implementation of law and to the enforcement of law. What I would say is that child protection services tend to be very rules and structure-oriented, and they lack the flexibility often required by sort of typical adolescent development, let alone the kind of flexibility and the kind of nimble response that might be required by adolescents who've experienced trauma, various forms of social isolation, mental health issues, and who are experiencing substance use and sometimes abuse kinds of situations. So it's going to be our job as new laws come into place to say, all right, you've got a new law. It's meant to be based on a child rights point of view. It's meant to do all these additional supportive kinds of things, but you have to make it work in that way because it won't inherently do that on its own. I would say that in our work with homeless young people at Justice for Children and Youth, we consistently face exclusion, barriers not only to sort of fundamental access to justice, like can you find a lawyer, can you find a court, can you find a way to make the law work for you, but even where there is access to justice because a lawyer from our office might be at your shelter or your youth-serving organization, we experience barriers in the implementation and the realization of rights. So I'm going to sort of end where I actually would like to begin, to say that lawyers are a tool in the toolbox, courts are a tool in the toolbox, so is law, legislation, judge-made law, but the real development and use of rights realization and housing as a human right in particular for our purposes today is to change the mindset of the people we live with. And that, I think, is the real and ultimate challenge. So it's our job to pursue a public awareness and a public perception of young people who are facing and experiencing homelessness and social exclusion. It's our job to frame those people as deserving of dignity, of our rights-based approach to their lives and their experiences, and to clearly create supports that provide dignified solutions to people who have sometimes in a multi-generational kinds of way experienced these things. So we want to ensure access to justice. We want to ensure that there are sustainable and long-term responses to existing homelessness, meaning dignified, rights-based, and cycle-breaking responses. And we want to ensure that there are prevention strategies that are rights-based and not dignity-taking, but dignity-giving kinds of responses that will help people to create new lives or to create lives that they have imagined but have not yet had access to. So I'm sorry to be kind of the downer version, but I think Naomi will pick us up again. Thanks very much.
Whew. First, I just want to say it's an honor to be part of this plenary discussion, and I've been trying to think as we were listening, say a word or two to Cindy, who showed real bravery this morning, and I get overwhelmed by the magnitude of the injustices that we're talking about up here on a panel, trying to be very professional. And so I can only imagine how that feels for her. And I just wanted to note that before I go on and try to do this talk. I didn't think this would happen. And I do this for a living, so you can imagine how tricky that was for her. I've been talking about homelessness from a human rights perspective for a while now. And every time I talk about homelessness from a human rights perspective, I try to bring the conversation to a new place. In part because I'm resisting the academic stereotype that we just recycle the same talk and do it over and over again. And I want it to be interesting. So today I'd like to pick up a thread from the last talk that I gave, which you would only know if you were in Peterborough, which maybe some of you were, and then chart a new path from there. So we'll do a little bit of back talking to sort of get you up to speed from where I was last thinking, and then we're going to move forward. In the last talk I gave, I stressed the importance of prevention as an essential means for actualizing our obligations to ensure that all young people experience the fundamental legal rights to live without homelessness and to have access to safe and appropriate housing. In particular, I emphasized primary prevention, because these are the things that we do that get to the root causes of youth homelessness, and these are the things that align, to me, most effectively with a human rights approach. Resonant with a primary prevention focus on identifying and addressing the systemic drivers of homelessness, a human rights approach directs our attention or reminds us of the historically situated, state-influenced patterns of exclusion, neglect, and discrimination. And we've heard a lot about these this morning from the panelists who came before me. So for example, the documented intersections between child welfare involvement and then the disproportionate chance that you're going to end up homeless later in life. Primary prevention also includes all of the things that we do to eliminate the conditions that make people vulnerable to forms of exclusion which underpin experiences of homelessness but do not directly cause it. For example, a focus on primary prevention requires that we consider and address the ways that colonialism, racism, cissexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and ableism contribute to some young people being more vulnerable to the possibility of homelessness than others. A commitment to preventing youth homelessness requires that we identify those young people who are disproportionately represented among populations experiencing homelessness, and that we create interventions that address and eradicate the discriminatory conditions that underpin this disproportionality that we've discovered. A primary prevention approach thus sits comfortably within a human rights framework which constitutionalizes people's rights to live without discrimination. So ordinarily then in a talk, I'd move from here into a discussion of the precise ways the state has failed to uphold its legal and ethical responsibilities to young people, particularly, and we've heard this already this morning, Indigenous, racialized, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and two-spirited youth, in terms of their access to safe and affordable housing, their rights to education and safety, and their rights to live freely from discrimination. And I would articulate all of the changes that need to be made in policy and institutions to address these failures. But today, I want to take a different tack, and I'm glad I have, given what we've already heard. Inspired by some of the research that I've been doing about how we can effectively move social science research into tangible practice, policy, and social changes, and picking up a thread from a book I read recently about addiction, I want to focus today on the ways that we, all of us in the room, and in the general public more broadly, are implicated in the human rights violations that the panelists before me have pointed to. And I want to suggest or remind us that what is required of us, all of us ordinary folks, in order to create the conditions in government necessary for action. So I'm sort of picking up where Mary left off, I hope. I want to suggest to you that one reason, and maybe the central one, that we have not as a country committed to ensuring that all people actually do have access to safe and appropriate housing is because people remain morally and ethically, even if secretly, committed to the idea that housing is something that people earn. Home and land ownership, the cornerstones of settler colonialism, have symbolic as well as monetary value to Canadians. figuring prominently in our Canadian imaginary. Particularly as the cost of housing continues to rise in Canada, significantly outpacing growth in wages, it gets harder and harder for ordinary people like you and I to get behind the idea that housing is a right. You don't need to earn it. This is significant because for the state to actualize its human rights obligations, there needs to be sufficient external pressure to condition the policy environment to create the political will to invest in transforming the existing system. Clearly, for 70 years, we haven't been able to do this. This part is on us. The evidence from economic, social, and health disciplines is unambiguous. Ensuring universal access to safe and appropriate housing is a cost-effective, socially progressive, and health-promoting intervention. By coupling this intervention with a national initiative to decriminalize drugs, we could effectively address the state's historical legacies of dislocation, the loss of psychological, social, and economic integration into family and culture, the sense of exclusion, isolation, and powerlessness that have been disproportionately shouldered by Indigenous, racialized, and LGBTQ2S peoples in Canada. But such a move would require that we, ourselves, that is all of us here in this room today, and the social networks that we are part of, our families, our friends, our work buddies, fundamentally buy into the legal and ethical principles at the core of human rights approaches to addressing homelessness, and let go of our moralizing reservations about who deserves access to housing. That's another part that I have trouble saying. Until we believe and are willing to act on the belief that all human beings, not just young people, but also the families with whom young people's experiences of homelessness have intersected, all human beings are legitimately deserving of a suite of fundamental rights, including but not limited to the right to housing, we are not in a position to create the external pressures necessary to drive political reforms, which we need to do to make any of these international treaties count. It is not, to quote Gabor Mate, the particulars of a social policy that matter most, but the relationship between those who influence policy and those who are affected by policy. Preventing youth homelessness requires a fundamental shift among all those in positions to influence policy. In order to ensure receptivity to the abundance of evidence in support of the eradication and decriminalization of poverty, homelessness, and addiction, decision makers must see all people as deserving of compassion and respect. We must actively and persuasively argue that the stress, isolation, and instability caused by making young people prove their capacity for housing, languish on wait lists, or settle for a shelter bed in the absence of suitable permanent housing will not promote positive and healthy developmental outcomes, including trusting relationships with caring adults and faith in our country's democratic processes and public institutions. With the political grounds conditioned in this way, we are positioned to implement the wide-scale systems transformation required to redress the systemic and structural processes of dislocation resulting from the Canadian state's continued relationship to the interconnected legacies of settler colonialism, slavery, and global capitalism, which continue to shape young people's experiences of homelessness and housing precarity. But we won't get there unless we, us, are willing to work through our own resistance to the idea that everyone in this country, regardless of their participation in the machinations of capitalism, is deserving of housing, health, food, work, education, and legal protections, as well as all of the humanistic conditions that the actualization of these basic human rights enables: joy, imagination, creativity, hopefulness, beauty, and love.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I'm feeling the same sense, I think, that the panelists have communicated, and I'm just really grateful that you're all here. And I also want to say that thank you, Naomi, for for mentioning. Cindy is tremendously courageous, and I just want to say I'm sure this room is feeling this, that we're grateful for her presence and thankful for that. So we were going to do a little bit of a back and forth on the panel, but I think given the time, I'd really like to maybe skip over that if that's okay with you folks, and then I will just invite guests from the audience to come up and ask our speakers whatever questions they have, and I'll just move this speaker over. So you guys change that. So yeah, so you can use both of those. So make sure and then, so there's a microphone here for anyone who would like to ask our panelists some questions. Thank you.
There was a lot.
That's good. Because everyone's, yes, please. Do you want to use the microphone there? Unless you can speak loudly. Yeah. Yeah. It's just right. It's right in the hall, in the aisle. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. So, you were mentioning about the United Nations, how they have a treaty, and you mentioned globalism and capitalism as well. So, my question is, do you see also the role of market forces and working with the market and with the current capitalistic system that we do exist within, the paradigm that we exist within, as also a great tool to change homelessness and move forward the mechanism that is affecting homelessness, which is the market forces that affects the housing prices and all of this. So do you think that their absence in the conversation is also not constructive as well? Because as you said, the treaty, as much as they're colorful, isn't it also the case too that market forces also influences state and laws? It's not necessarily laws influences law influences market forces, but isn't it also the case where market forces pushes law, so or changes law? And a big example would be the lobby system in America and Canada, and also a great example of that also would be the minimum wage in Ontario that's happening, which is Tim Hortons is responding. Sorry, it's a long question, but yeah, I'm just trying to express fully what I'm trying to say. So and the bottom line is the participation and working with the current system that we do exist within, as much as it is flawed or fundamentally crappy, sucky system that we exist within. So thank you.
Who wants to take that? Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yes.
I think it's really good that you brought into the conversation the importance of addressing the fundamental political economic relations upon which everything else sort of rests. And so you're right to suggest that market conditions or these political economic relations fundamentally influence the degree to which we are able to actualize the democratic potential of our state institutions. Yes, lobbyists have figured out access to government. They're often corporate lobbyists. If we work with them, sometimes we get access to. This is a problematic set of conditions that are structuring our relations and our work, our ongoing efforts. I think the unfettered rising costs of housing in Toronto and Vancouver and other cities have been disastrous for everyone, but I think partly in terms of destabilizing what could be solidarity among people in terms of arguing for access to housing as a human right. When everyone is working so hard just to barely be able to pay their rent, you have less left to argue for someone else's rights to housing because you feel like you can't even actualize your own. And so I think we need to start paying attention to these things that are happening beneath us or behind our backs, as Marx would say, and sort of bring them forward so we can see them and then navigate effectively through them. And this is not an anti-capitalist diatribe, but we need to understand the conditions within which our work really takes place, and then only then can we effectively get at those real root drivers of the lack of uptake, even in terms of what did you say, flashy or pretty human rights conventions that have been in place for a long time, but that we haven't been able to do very much with.
Well, and sorry, and also like I forgot to mention that sometimes what do you call it? Sometimes the fact that as much as it is like enforcement is needed. When you mentioned labor laws and things like that, the reality though, despite there is enforcement and labor institution or tenancy institution, it doesn't necessarily mean that on a private frontline level those are happening. So like an intrinsic force within the business owners and maybe start shifting towards incentivizing landlords and owners that instead of seeing it as a business, that there is an economic cost to homelessness and talking to them from a financial level instead of emotional level. Sorry, I just wanted to add that. Yeah.
Well, sorry, and there have been some really useful reports produced by people like Eric Latimer in Montreal at McGill that show that it's just frankly much more cost effective to house people than it is to only provide emergency services, which is what people will use when they don't have access to the stabilizing conditions that come with housing. So there have been really strategic and important efforts in this way to show that, yes, even from a cost-benefit point of view, this makes sense. But it seems to me that even that hasn't always opened up the kinds of changes we would like to see. So they're important tools, but there's more work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add except to say that I mean, you raise very good points and very good questions, and I think there is some constantly these interesting sort of intersections about, you know, 6-year-olds and experienced academics understand why as a human matter, as an economic matter, and from many other, you know, as an ethical matter from many other points of view, there are some of these things that are just fundamentally true and make good sense. And trying to convince the rest of us that we should be engaged in that conversation, I think, is one of the challenges that I was trying to identify. And you know, and all of what Claire described, which were some of the facts that we know are all part. You know, the information is not new, and the information is not hard to find or to understand. Making it all work together is, I think, where some of the challenge lies. And you say that.
Seeing none, did you want to respond to one another's comment? We have about 5 minutes left, so we still get that in there.
Yeah, I'm wrestling a little bit with what I was going to say because I've so Egal Center's got a huge chunk of private money. That is, and our youth drop-in was opened on private money. And as someone who has eschewed corporatization of my community for a very long time, you know, I either run away from the reality or I name it. Like I'm 51 years old and I'm sick of putting young people on waiting lists. Yeah. And I'm at a place now where as long as they don't try to paint me green, I'll say, okay, thank you very much. How can we work together? And at this point, I'm not squirming too much and I'm feeling like when I say the things that I said in my presentation to all the people who are currently helping us do the work, I say all the people, they go, yes. And as long as that's okay and that works, then I'm not that I can tell the organization that hires me what to do, but I can feel okay. And again, it took me 51 years maybe to get to this place. But what does that mean? Does it let the government off the hook? No. And we are going back to the government and we are going to be pushing at a federal and a provincial level to say more, please, because it does cost more than what we have. And it's going to take the work of all of us and more. And I really appreciate your question.
Are there any closing thoughts from our panel, or anyone else have something they'd like to say from the audience? Or okay. Well, with that, I'd like to thank very much our panelists, and again, please a warm appreciation for them. That was fascinating. It gives us a lot to think about and to go forth for the next 3 days, but also the rest of our working time. And I know some of the panelists are also in other workshops during the conference. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll be seeing you around. Thank you.